Boldwood presents What the Lady Wants, written by Emma Orchard and read by Bella Sanby. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. Autumn 1816. The Duchess of North Riding's Ball. Number 1. Isabella was excited, arriving in Grosvenor Square and climbing the steps to enter the mansion between rows of tall footmen in black and silver livery. It had been dark for hours, and flickering torches struck gleams of light from the jewels and costly gold lace that adorned the Duchess's distinguished guests and from their avid eyes. The air of anticipation was almost palpable. Isabella was sure, though, that her internal turmoil must be of quite a different order from the emotions of the other guests. They were there to dance, to observe, and to gossip, perhaps to flirt. She had so much more at stake. But that was a dangerous way to think, and liable to make her panic. She was all too aware of her growing agitation, and told herself sternly and silently that she must suppress it. She had made a plan, and she was about to set about its execution, that was all. She scanned the crowd eagerly but surreptitiously for him, conversing with her companions and greeting acquaintances in a mechanical sort of way, and paying very little attention to her opulent surroundings, familiar as they were. She'd spent part of her honeymoon in this impressive mansion not so very long ago. Isabella, or to give her the proper title, Lady Ashby Mauleverer, was not yet 22, but she was a widow. Her husband, Lord Ashby, second son of the 8th Duke of North Riding and brother of the 9th, had died at Waterloo. Had died in her arms, the day after the battle, in fact, and the shock of his death and the horrifying manner of it had caused Isabella to enter a dark time, a period lasting a year or more which she preferred not to remember, certainly not to dwell on. She had recovered, though, with the support of her family and the most modern and humane medical aid, and one of the things that had helped her to do so was a private resolution she had made to take control of her life. That was the purpose of her plan. After a long time in which she had not even been able to decide whether to rise or stay in bed, what to wear, what to eat, or how to spend the day, she would be in charge. If her plan worked, completely in charge. She had been discharged from her doctor's care in the summer, and now it was autumn. Against the wishes of her parents, who persisted in seeing her as fragile and probably always would, she had come to London to stay with her sister-in-law, Lady Blanche Fitzhenry, and tonight she was attending a grand ball at Mauleverer House, which her brother-in-law Gabriel and his bride Georgiana were giving to celebrate their marriage a couple of months ago. This was the perfect occasion to set her scheme in motion, because she was confident that not a single one of the guests present tonight would be looking at her or noticing what she did. She had been something of a novelty in a small way when she had first emerged into London society, a young and quite well-off widow. Her jointure was ample and would not cease if she remarried, undeniably well-connected and not unattractive, she supposed. Ash had found her beautiful, had told her so 1,000 times. No, she would not think about Ash now. She must not. But she had attended many parties and other events over the last few weeks, had done nothing at all to provoke any comment yet, and any interest that the sensation-loving ladies and gentlemen of the haut ton had been disposed to show in her had waned. She, and every other topic of gossip that summer and autumn, had been eclipsed by the far more fascinating subject of Gabriel and Georgiana, and the thrilling, scandalous circumstances of their recent union. This suited Isabella very well, and she felt herself to be as good as invisible in the crowded silver and white ballroom, which was already full almost to the point of discomfort, with loudly chattering persons, dressed in the very height of fashion. Lady Jersey was close by, conversing with Lady Sefton in the genteel sort of shriek that was necessary to make oneself heard above the din. Isabella was truly surrounded by the very cream of the polite world. It seemed that even those who had been absent from London this autumn had returned for this most intriguing of events. There was a hum of expectation as the music struck up. The newly married Duke and Duchess took to the floor and opened the dancing, both of them dark and glamorous and endlessly fascinating, their love for each other written plainly on their faces, and Isabella's hand was, as she had hoped, solicited for her first set by Captain Leo Winterton. He was tall, broad-shouldered, handsome. He also looked nothing at all like Ash. The first part wasn't terribly important, or shouldn't be, but the second part was. Isabella was aware that the execution of her plan would surely remind her of her husband, and she was resigned to the inevitability of that. There was no need to make things worse by choosing a man who resembled Ash in any way. Lord Ashby had been tall, like all his family, but he had also been dark, his black hair prematurely streaked with silver, his eyes a striking shade of silver too. His older brother, the Duke, resembled him greatly, and in the early stages of her bereavement, Isabella had found it hard to look at Gabriel, and especially to see little quirks of expression, little mannerisms that the brothers had shared. She had reason to be proud that she had been able to put all that behind her now and meet Gabriel with composure. She had done so not half an hour since, but it would be foolish to tempt fate by choosing a tall, dark, grey-eyed man to help her execute her scheme. Captain Leo Winterton was by contrast fair as she was, and his eyes were a clear blue, his complexion tanned by his years at sea. He seemed sunny-natured, of a cheerful, light-hearted disposition, and again, this was unlike Ash, who had been intense, serious, though never humourless. The two men were perhaps similar in height and build, but in casting her eyes over her possibilities, this was a different list. Isabella was quite addicted to lists. She had discovered in herself a natural preference for a tall man, and she could not see any harm in indulging it. Although there was no possibility of what she planned leading to anything lasting, it was most necessary that she found the man attractive, and she did. She was prepared to admit as much to herself, though of course to nobody else. Hence, perhaps, her excitement tonight. He smiled down at her as they danced, and they conversed of nothing in particular, but in a comfortable, easy fashion. They had only recently become acquainted during the past few weeks of Isabella's stay in London, and they were in a sense related, if only distantly and by marriage, since Captain Winterton was Georgiana's first cousin, and Georgiana was now Isabella's sister-in-law and Gabriel's new Duchess. There was a certain safety, she thought, in choosing someone who was in some sense a member of the family, and therefore unlikely, if it turned out that he greatly disapproved of her scheme, to spread dangerous gossip. Isabella did not much care if she became the subject of society murmurs once her plan was successful, not on her own account, as she did not intend to stay in London beyond this short visit. But she had no desire to embarrass Ash's sister Blanche, who had been nothing but good to her. And if her parents came to hear of it, which she devoutly hoped they never would, she knew it would hurt them, and heaven knows they had been hurt and worried enough already since her bereavement. When the set ended, she cast down her eyes and said, I feel a little unwell. The heat of the room. Would you escort me somewhere cooler, sir?" The captain was instantly all solicitude, and she felt a little guilty. "You do look pale, Ma'am. Can I fetch my cousin or Lady Blanche?" "No," she blurted out, alarmed. That would not suit her purposes at all. And then, in gentler tones, "If you could give me your arm and take me out into the garden for a moment. It's just beyond the end of the entrance hall on the right, through the furthest door. I do not want to make a fuss or attract unwelcome attention, and I should hate to spoil the party for anyone." This much was true. Isabella knew the house well, and soon they had pushed through the press of people. In a moment or two they were outside. If she'd really been unwell, she'd probably have swooned long since in the heat and the crowd, but luckily she wasn't. It was indeed much cooler out here, which was no great surprise given that it was October, and Captain Winterton was about to express concern that it might be too cold for a lady's delicate constitution after the heat inside, she thought, when she forestalled him by melting into his arms. She did this by essentially flinging herself at his chest and putting her gloved hands upon it to cling to him. It was a little awkward, since he was not in the least expecting it. As chests went, it really was agreeably broad and firmly muscled, she noticed in passing as she clung. He was taken aback. The courtyard garden was not well lit, illuminated as it was only by the light that spilt out from the ballroom windows that overlooked it. But she could see an expression of puzzlement upon his handsome features. He did not appear disgusted by her proximity, but he was surprised by it, certainly. "You are unwell, Ma'am," he said. "I cannot think you mean—" But his strong arms came around her, as if by instinct. Perhaps he thought she would fall if he did not support her, and in that instant she thought perhaps she might, and she looked up at him and said, "I am perfectly well. I am sorry for deceiving you, but I could not think of any other way of ensuring that we should be alone. I was hoping, you see, that you might kiss me." "You were?" "Yes," she said. He was still holding her, which was good, but he wasn't kissing her, which was excessively disappointing. "I thought you wanted to, but I fear I was mistaken." "Oh, no," he said, and she thought she saw a ghost of a smile across his face. "No, you weren't mistaken." And he bent his head, and his lips found hers. He was very gentle at first, but it was pleasant. It was more than pleasant, and when she opened her mouth a little in encouragement, he was not slow to respond. His lips were warm and soft, and his breath was sweet. He smelled good. He felt good. He held her tightly in the shadows, though his hands did not explore her body, and he kissed her very thoroughly, and she kissed him back with great enthusiasm, and only a tiny little corner of her brain thought, "Ash will no longer be the last man I kissed, or the only man I ever kissed." But that was part of the point, so she repressed the fugitive thought, and gave herself up to the sensual enjoyment of the moment, and the comfort of being held in a strong embrace after so long. When at last he drew away from her a little, but only a little, she looked up at him, and was glad to see that his eyes were dark with desire, and his face soft with pleasure and a sort of wonder. "Lady Ashby, Isabella," he said, his voice low and drugged with a sensation. It was rather thrilling to think that she had had this effect on him, especially since she found herself not unaffected too. "I did not intend or expect—" "I know you didn't," she said, and she was surprised to hear her voice emerge as a sensual sort of sigh, almost a moan. This would never do. "I know you didn't," she repeated more firmly. It was important to be businesslike, to keep her head, to take control. But I did. I realise that now, he said, his ready humour warming in his voice. Did you— I apologise if this is too strong a word, but I am in a sorry state of confusion and can think of no better. Did you bring me here with the intention of seducing me, Ma'am? No, well, yes, I suppose so, she conceded in a spirit of fair-mindedness. But you liked kissing me, didn't you? It wasn't in any way disagreeable to you? She knew he'd liked it. His body had betrayed exactly how much, but she thought it best not to mention that just now. It would be crude, unladylike, and although Ash had not objected to a little plain speaking in such matters, her experience did not extend beyond him, and she could not tell if Captain Winterton might feel the same or not. If her plan worked, she would find out. She could not suppress a delicious little shudder at the thought. He was still holding her close. His hands about her waist and her arms, it seemed, had crept up around his neck and were still there. It was a little awkward now, but it hardly seemed the moment to remove them. It was very far from being disagreeable, he said. It was rather wonderful, in fact. I hope you liked it too. Oh, yes, she said a little breathlessly. I liked it very much. I thought I would, and I was glad to be right. Because I have a proposition to put to you, sir. I have a list. Chapter 1. Autumn 1816, a few weeks earlier. He'd seen her at last, met her again when he had least expected it. Leo was presented to Lady Ashby directly after his arrival in London, and he feared he'd gaped at her in sad confusion for a long moment before he gathered his scattered wits and greeted her. But if his reaction had been odd, it seemed nobody had noticed. She certainly hadn't. If she had the slightest recollection of ever having laid eyes on him before, let alone been introduced, dancing together, she showed no sign of it. So in common courtesy, he had no option but to do the same and greet her as a stranger. Good God, he discovered now to his astonishment that she was a sort of connection of his. Her late husband, whom he remembered perfectly well, had been the younger brother of the rather intimidating Duke of North Riding, who was now married to Leo's own madcap cousin Georgiana. Setting aside this unexpected family connection, there was not the least reason why he should be surprised to see her. It wasn't impossible or even unlikely, after all, that a young lady, once encountered in society in Brussels just before Waterloo, when the city had been full of British soldiers of high rank and their families, should be met again 18 months later in London. It might even be considered inevitable, the world of the autant being so small, and he, in some sense, a part of it now. Leo had tried, over the last year or more, to tell himself that he had no hope or expectation of ever setting eyes on her again. He'd known that it would be both wrong and useless to wish to do so, because she was happily married, and he was not the sort of man who pursued a married woman, or pined after her like a mooncalf. He'd never done such a thing in his life, and he had no intention of starting now. If he had dreamed of her, when he had told himself sternly that he had no business permitting himself such a shocking liberty. Their acquaintance had been so very brief, barely deserving the name, though he could not deny that it had assumed a greater importance in his mind, both at the time and afterwards. He'd been at a loose end during the summer of 1815, his ship, Paris, undergoing long overdue repairs in the naval dockyards, and an unusual spirit of restlessness had seized him. Bonaparte had escaped from Elba and was rallying his scattered legions for what must surely be his final throw of the dice. Britain and its allies were assembling to meet him. It seemed tame to sit at home when such momentous events were unfolding just across the Channel. His estate was in good order, and his widowed mother was spending the summer at some seaside resort with his orphaned young cousins. He felt a little guilty leaving her to it, but all at once it was unbearable for a man of spirit to spend his precious free time bear-leading 3 wild young cubs and attempting to keep them out of mischief when he could be witnessing history in the making. He'd crossed to the continent almost on an impulse on a crowded packet boat and found cramped lodgings in a Brussels inn. Then, along with the rest of Europe, he waited to see what would happen, with Bonaparte in Paris making his plans and the Allied armies gathering here, a scant 200 miles away. He'd not expected the summer to consist chiefly of balls, picnics and parties, rather than military alarums, but so it had proved, at least at first. There was a sort of hectic excitement in the air, a sense of imminent danger that gave spice to the most ordinary of events, and Leo found himself caught up in it. Though he had no intimate friends in the town, he'd introductions aplenty, as half his naval shipmates seemed to have brothers or cousins serving in Wellington's army. They were welcoming and friendly, albeit very ready to mock a member of the senior service and call him all sorts of unflattering names. But since they were about to risk their lives in battle, and he currently wasn't, he could hardly argue, and must smile at their roasting and retaliate in kind, calling them Hyde Park soldiers. Friendship, even intimacy, seemed to blossom quickly here, as the normal rules of society had not broken down, but certainly had eased, and this was how he found himself dancing one warm summer evening with a young lady with dark blonde hair and big brown eyes. He didn't know her name, and he'd go bail she didn't know his. It was most unusual, even irregular, but in this time and place it didn't seem to matter. He'd been presented to her in a scrambling sort of fashion by one of his new military friends, but the young lieutenant was slightly foxed already, and besides, the large inn's assembly room was crowded and very noisy, so that he hadn't caught the casual words properly. Lady A something? Lady Anne? Lady Alice? A woman of high rank, then, the daughter of a nobleman. But she didn't seem like it, putting on no die-away airs, but only smiling at him in an open, friendly way as he bowed over her hand. The scraping of fiddles resolved itself into an actual tune, a country dance, and the sets formed up in somewhat chaotic fashion. There was little room to turn and step. It was not at all convenient, but most of the dancers were young and in giddy, infectious high spirits, and they were smiling as they made their way up and down, trying, and not always succeeding, to avoid bumping into others. Nobody seemed to mind. Soon he was laughing at the sheer ridiculousness of it, and so was his partner. She had a lovely laugh, free and unaffected, enchanting. And she was lovely, all in blue, her hair shining in the candlelight. She wasn't delicate and willowy and disturbingly fragile seeming like many of the other young ladies he danced with here, nor was she elegant and remote. She was real. She was short, voluptuous, all soft, womanly curves. Her hair was a rich, honey blonde, long and straight, worn braided around her head, and even as he danced, he experienced a sudden, strong, forbidden desire to undo the braids, shake it free, run his fingers through its silkiness, then bury his face in it. He imagined it would smell wonderful, and he'd love to have a chance to find out. Her eyes were a deep brown, very large and expressive, and it seemed to him that she looked at the world with a frank, level gaze that he was beginning to find enormously appealing. They spoke a little, breathlessly, as they whirled, and she did not chatter or flirt or giggle shrilly, but was direct, matter-of-fact, her face flushed with honest enjoyment. It was a brief moment, and he couldn't fool himself, then or later, that they'd established any sort of special connection, but how he'd have liked to. He'd not previously been aware of loneliness among so many people, but now, oddly, he was. The set had barely finished when another fellow claimed her hand in a possessive fashion, a tall, dark man in the gold-laced uniform of a crack cavalry regiment. She knew him well, clearly, and didn't seem to resent his presumption. With a brief, apologetic smile at Leo, she allowed herself to be whirled away into the next dance. He was left standing, feeling a little foolish, arms empty, suddenly bereft, and stabbed by a sharp pang of jealousy, as ridiculous as it was unwelcome. He'd hoped to dance with her again. One of the new waltzes would have been perfect. But although he looked for her for the rest of the evening, he hadn't found her. He could only presume that she'd left. No doubt she had other invitations aplenty. He tried to ask his friend Lieutenant Patterson who she was, but the inebriated young idiot had just shrugged and said he couldn't recall introducing Leo to anybody at all. Leo had seen her again, though. He hadn't passed the last year and more, thinking wistfully about a woman he danced with once and never set eyes on after. He wasn't quite as bad as that. He spent a great deal of time over the next few days joining the fashionable afternoon promenade in the crowded streets and extensive park of the town, or sitting at outdoor cafes, watching the colourful throng pass by. And eventually his perseverance was rewarded. Suddenly, with a little leap of the heart, he saw her in an open carriage, shielding herself with a lacy parasol and accompanied by an older couple, who must surely be her parents. So greatly did the lady resemble her in form, feature, and colouring. Daylight did Lady A no disservice. She was every bit as attractive as he'd thought, and as he stood by the roadside, quite close to her barouche, she turned her head and saw him. Could he flatter himself that she blushed just a little? He couldn't be sure, but she smiled at him in recognition, as warm and open as she'd been before, and he smiled too, and bowed to her. They were close enough that they could have greeted each other, and he was about to speak. But then the obstruction in traffic that had permitted this tiny, insignificant counter cleared, and the carriage had moved on before he could utter a word. It had been the second week in June by then, and the hourglass was running down on the hectic gaiety of the city. But there'd been another impromptu assembly at the same inn just before the end, and this time Lieutenant Patterson was sober and alert. All sorts of rumours were swirling around to the effect that battle might be joined very soon, and every man of Wellington's army must be ready for it, so that when Leo saw the young lady enter with her parents, he was able to say with what he hoped was sufficient carelessness, "Patterson, that's the girl you presented me to a few nights ago, but I never caught her name, though I danced and conversed with her. It's cursed awkward. I see her everywhere, and she plainly recognises me, but I cannot speak a word to her. Could you be a good fellow and tell me who she is?" Patterson craned his neck and then whistled. "The tall beauty with the red hair and painted toenails? Well, I see you navy dogs have dangerous tastes. That's the notorious—" "No, you clodpole, not her. The shorter woman, the blonde braided hair and the gold silk." The gold silk that clung quite charmingly to her frame, Leo couldn't help but notice. "Oh, I see her now. You mean that plump little dab of a thing?" he said casually. "That's Isabella Richmond. I grew up with her in Harrogate, you know. She pushed me in a pond once. Can't recall why." "I thought you called her Lady something," said Leo with exaggerated patience.
Of course I did. She's Lady Ashby, Malevolent now, married to North Riding's brother, this past 12-month. Quite the love match. Don't see her pushing him in ponds."
"Married," said Leo dazedly. It hadn't so much as occurred to him that she could be. And now he didn't know why he'd been so blind. She'd been wearing gloves, of course, so her wedding ring hadn't been visible. And if there had been subtle clues in the way she had dressed to indicate her status and her unavailability, he'd missed them. Perhaps he wanted to miss them. And as he watched, he saw that the tall, dark cavalry officer he'd seen her with before was present now, too, right at her side, smiling down at her warmly, intimately, and she was smiling up at him with what he could not help but recognise as love written on her sweet face. They looked happy. They were happy. And he felt like an idiot. 3 days later, he now knew, the man was dead and cold, along with so many others on the fields of Quatre Bras, Ligny and Waterloo. His regiment had fought with outstanding bravery and suffered appalling losses, Lord Ashby among them. Leo had seen these wounded men and would never forget the awful sight. Cavalry and infantry and artillerymen, hundreds upon hundreds of them. He had helped carry them into inns and private houses so that they could be cared for, had fetched and carried for the nurses and the surgeons. He'd done what little he could to help, even if that had meant just gripping a frightened boy's hand in futile reassurance and talking to him as he died in agony, screaming pitifully for his mamma, or, more mercifully, slipped into a sleep from which he never awoke. He'd had similar experiences at sea, of course, had lost close friends. But the sheer scale of this, not to mention the incongruous domestic setting, was new and horrifying. Leo hadn't known that at the time, of course, that Lady Ashby's husband had been one of those poor fellows. How could he? He had never seen the notice of one man's death among so many others, and now that he had the information, he wasn't sure what to do with it. She was free, but it seemed entirely wrong to be glad of it. Chapter 2. Leo Winterton was 27 years old and had spent almost half of his life in the Navy. But the wars were over at last, thank God, and he was done with it all. He had passed the wet, cold summer of 1816, teaching his wild young cousins how to sail. But now they were at school. God help the school and its poor unsuspecting teachers, and he was at a loose end. His older cousin and close friend Hal, Lord Earlham, aware of his lack of purpose, had invited him to come and stay with him and his wife Cassandra at their grand mansion in town, and, for want of anything better to do, he had agreed, and here he was. He had little experience of polite society. Whatever the Navy had been, it hadn't been that. And after taking ship so young, this was his first real taste of London parties and London life. Somewhat to his surprise, he had found himself in demand in a modest sort of way. He was well-born and well-connected enough, though he was no aristocrat, and somehow word had got round that he had taken several valuable prizes during the late wars with France, and had won by his exertions a respectable fortune to add to the modest sum and small Hampshire estate his father had left him. Various young ladies had looked up at him with melting eyes and invited him to share his fascinating reminiscences of life at sea with them. These offers he had politely declined. He had no taste for puffing off his own consequence, and he didn't think any of these refined damsels were really interested in what it was like to go into battle, the sights, the sounds, the smells. No. But it was undeniably pleasant to be clean, healthy, well-fed and well-dressed, with nobody firing cannon at him or attempting to put a period to his life in any other manner. and to take a good-looking young woman in his arms and twirl about the dance floor in exhilarating motion. The waltz was now danced everywhere, and it was an innovation greatly to his liking. It was pleasant, too, to ride in the park on one of Hal's excellent horses, and to sit at ease in Hal's club and take a glass or two of good wine with one of his Corinthian friends. Or to while away a few hours in pugilistic exercise at Gentleman Jackson's saloon, where Hal was a regular and favoured visitor. He found also that he enjoyed Cassandra's company, and this was new. He had been back at sea when his cousin had married her last autumn, so he had only made her acquaintance quite recently, and he liked her enormously. She and Hal were plainly very well suited and very happy, and perhaps inevitably, the sight of them together made a man think of settling down. He'd never thought about marriage before. As a naval ensign, lieutenant, and then commander, it had not crossed his mind. He'd been too young. And when, a little older, he had gained his own ship and really begun to make his way in the world, he had been too occupied to dwell on such things. It had seemed unwise to cherish dreams that might never be realised, when a French cannonball or a wickedly sharp falling spar or heavy piece of timber could at any moment have cut him down, knocked him overboard, crushed or maimed him. But here he was, whole and more or less undamaged, unlike so many, and he felt for the first time in his life the pleasure of refined feminine society as he sat in Cassandra's parlour and took tea with her. He was not in the least in love with her, but she was friendly, sympathetic, quick-witted, as well as undeniably attractive to look upon, and he could perfectly understand why his cousin had fallen for her so quickly and completely. He was not a savage. He had spent time with his mother, of course, while on leave, but he realised now that he was not closely acquainted with very many young ladies at all, and none who were not his relations by blood. This was an omission that should be rectified, he felt, and London was the place to do it. If he cherished a memory of a girl in blue laughing up at him one warm night in Brussels, he'd pushed it away. It had, after all, been nothing more than a fantasy. And then he set eyes on Lady Ashby again so unexpectedly. It hurt just a little to see that she had no memory at all of him, but when he realised that her husband had fallen at Waterloo, had been recovered from the battlefield, horribly wounded, and died in her arms, he understood why it should be so, after all that she had suffered, and could not think to blame her for it. The last thing he wanted to do was remind her of that time, which had ended in such tragedy for her, and so he said nothing. Having not mentioned it at first, of course, it was now too late to raise the matter, as their intimacy increased. The connection between the families meant that they were often in each other's company as the weeks passed. If he'd wanted to avoid her, which he didn't at all, he'd hardly have found it possible. They made up pleasant family parties and attended the theatre, the opera, and many private events. It was very odd indeed to think of Georgie the tearaway as her Grace the Duchess, married to a reformed rake with a terrible reputation, but they seemed ridiculously happy, just like Hal and Cassandra. Everybody was married and everybody was happy. Nobody was single and lonely and a little sad going to sleep and waking up in a cold, empty bed, apart from him. And dare he imagine her? Leo felt that fate, Providence, or one of those Greek deities they'd bored on about endlessly at school, was practically yelling at him, irritated by his obtuseness. "See these other fellows? This could be you, sapskull." Could it really? Could the past be overcome so easily? Slowly, cautiously, Leo began to hope that it might. He thought at first that Lady Ashby, a widow of a duke's younger son as he now knew her to be, must be far above his touch. But on talking to her, he'd found to his delight that this was not the case at all. As he grew to know her better, he discovered that she came, in fact, from a background much like his own. Her parents had a small estate just outside Harrogate, and like him, she was an only child, having lost several siblings in infancy. She told him with a frankness that touched his heart that she had met Lord Ashby, a major in the 7th Hussars, when he had been recuperating in the spa town of Harrogate from wounds taken around the time of Toulouse, and thus her connection with a grand ducal house was only by marriage rather than by blood. This was heartening, as it was not entirely dissimilar to his own relationship with the Pendlebury family. His father had been a solid country gentleman of unremarkable fortune, and his mother was a country lady, whose late sister had happened to marry very well, becoming Countess of Earlham. He believed with some confidence that he need not fear that she, Lady Ashby, Isabella, her parents, nor anybody in her family would think him presumptuous in aspiring to her hand. He did aspire to it, he realised as the weeks passed and their acquaintance deepened. But he resolved to take things slowly. It would be foolish to rush matters, and he must be patient. It was not just a question of respecting her grief, though that was responsibility enough. He understood from things that Isabella herself had said, for it seemed to him that deception or concealment were entirely foreign to her nature, that she had been most unwell after her husband had died, and lost in a sort of fog of unhappiness for a long time, from which she had only now emerged. He detected in himself a desire to take care of her, to protect her from the world, but he could see that that was not in the least what she wanted. Quite the reverse, in fact. In a burst of entirely characteristic frankness, and not quite characteristic volubility, she had told him one brisk, cold day, as they strolled together in the park with Cassandra and Georgie, a week or so before the Duchess's ball, that she had come to London to escape from her parents, and a concern for her that she had begun to experience as stifling and oppressive, though she understood why they should feel so anxious about her always. Their companions, being ahead of them arm in arm, clearly exchanging confidences, Countess to Duchess, Lady Ashby had spoken openly to him of her illness. He had not at the time understood why she had chosen to confide in him of all people, but he had been glad of it, taking it as a sign that their relationship was deepening and heading in the direction that he so ardently desired it should. "I was mad for a while," she said, looking up at him with those liquid brown eyes that made him melt into a puddle of wanting. He must have made some instinctive protest, for she said matter-of-factly, "No, I really was. It seemed to me so wrong that Ash should be dead, and I just could not believe it for the longest time. He was so very alive, you see, and then, such a short while later, the sight of him so terribly wounded, in such dreadful pain, was always present to me, and it was a nightmare time. But one does not speak of such things. Forgive me, sir." He hastened to tell her that he understood, that there was nothing to forgive. And it was true, of course. He too had seen terrible things, things of which one did not speak. Things which most young ladies could have no comprehension of, and why should they? Was that not one of the reasons men fought, to shelter women from such things? But she had not been so sheltered, and he knew she loved her husband, and he her. He'd seen them together, glowing with happiness, but of course he could not say so. She was not done. She continued bravely on as the autumn leaves fell around them in a whirl of bright colour. "Ash and I had so many plans for our life together. and it was very hard for me to understand at last that none of them would come to pass. My brother-in-law had not the least intention of marrying at that point in his life, you know, before he met your cousin. He was quite open about the fact with everybody, and so it was generally expected that Ash and I would have children and raise them at North Riding. And then in the course of time, he, or our son, would eventually inherit the ducal title and the estate. So far more was lost than our future together. North Riding itself was suddenly in peril, with nobody to inherit after Gabriel. Their poor young cousin John, the next heir, died after Waterloo too, you see. And I felt such a failure, you know, because I'd not been able to give all of them, an heir, when they were all depending on me. I knew they were counting on me for that. Though of course they never spoke of their bitter disappointment. They scarcely needed to, and so somehow I persuaded myself that not all of him was gone, and that I was indeed with child. I could easily have been so, you understand. He did. Once more they were speaking of matters that were not generally discussed, but he could not think to stop her, and it was ridiculous and unseemly to be jealous of her intimacy with a dead man, and one, furthermore, who had fallen in battle, given his precious life and all his future for his country, even though he had been a duke's son and surely need not have put himself at risk. But I wasn't. I was deceiving myself, and that too was a great grief to me when I was forced to realise it, and my illness came back, and I was truly not in my right mind for quite a while. I was under the care of a doctor in York, where they specialise in such matters. Everyone was very kind to me and patient, my parents most of all. But now I am better, and although I am very grateful, and always will be, for the care they took of me, I can quite understand that it will take them a long while to accept that I am well now, and stop treating me as though I were made of china, because I'm not. She tilted up her chin adorably when she said this, and he wanted to kiss her then and there, but of course he couldn't. It would be most improper, and she could not possibly welcome it. They are bound to be protective of you, I suppose, he said instead. I know they are, but that's why I came away, to stay with my sister-in-law. I think it will be good for them as well as me not to always be worrying that I'm becoming unwell if I say the least little thing that makes them think I am cast down or low in spirits, as anybody must be every now and then. Because, she said with a perfectly straight face, sometimes when they hover over me with anxious expressions on their dear faces, much as I love them, I want to scream and throw things. Which would relieve your feelings for a short time, no doubt, but hardly reassure them as to your complete recovery. Exactly, she replied in tones of satisfaction. And that is why it is so much better to be staying with Blanche and her daughter Eleanor, because although they are very fond of me, and were worried about me when I was ill, they were naturally never concerned about me in just the way that my parents were, nor did they see me at my very worst. I do understand, he said. I too have a mother who worries. I did not know. Well, obviously I did, for everyone has a mother, at least to begin with. They laughed a little awkwardly, both visibly relieved to speak of less intense matters. Does Mrs. Winterton not care for London's society, then? By tacit, mutual consent, their conversation turned to lighter topics, and presently they caught up with Cassandra and Georgiana, who appeared to be still so absorbed in their conversation that they had not even noticed their absence. After this moment of closeness, Leo met Isabella frequently and danced with her on several occasions, but he had no opportunity to converse privately with her again until she engineered their moment together at Georgiana's ball. That was entirely unexpected. At first, he had feared she was unwell, and no thought of anything else had entered his mind. But when she pressed herself against him, he realised, for he would have been very dull-witted indeed not to realise, that she had planned this. She soon admitted as much. She wanted him to kiss her. She said she did. And Christ knew he wanted that too. When he brushed her lips with his, a little tentatively, her mouth opened to him in invitation, sweet and wet and tempting. It was all he had dreamed of. And when he nibbled on her full lower lip, she gave a tiny gasp, and her arms came up to clasp about his neck, and she pressed her lush body closer yet. God, it was so good. Leo had himself under very strict control, and so it was a kiss. The kiss she had asked for and nothing more. He held her tightly about the waist, and she fitted into his embrace as though she belonged there, warm and soft and gloriously right. But he did not allow himself to explore her body. He wanted to run his hands down her back and caress every curve and hollow. He wanted to pull up her gown and petticoats and touch her bare skin. He wanted to lift her up so she could wrap her legs around his waist while he pressed himself hard and hot against her belly. He wanted to plunder her mouth with his tongue and then kiss his way down her shoulders to her breasts. He wanted all sorts of things that would be wonderful, but wrong. He kissed her, and she kissed him back. And if she were aware of the urgency of his desire, and he thought she must be, as a woman who had been married, she gave no sign of it. When the kiss was finished, and it had to finish before he lost his self-control entirely, he spoke to her. He wasn't entirely sure what he said, but she seemed to gather her wits more quickly than he did. At first, he thought she might be proposing marriage to him, and although it was undoubtedly unconventional and sudden, he would have been perfectly happy to accept, to say, "Yes, Isabella, I will marry you. Please let it be very soon, and in the meantime, may I kiss you again?" But no, it didn't seem to be that at all. He couldn't imagine what it could be. He was still holding her, and had no wish to let her go. She didn't seem to want to be released, was still relaxed and warm in his embrace. Every inch of him was still thrumming with unfulfilled desire, and he would have wagered she was in the same state. His body had decided opinions about all this, about the desirability of continuing and the madness of stopping, and it was almost impossible to think, to do anything at all but feel while he held her. But he must. "A proposition?" he said dazedly. "You have a list? I'm afraid I don't perfectly understand what you mean, Mom." Chapter 3. Number 1. Again. "I don't suppose you do," Isabella said. Again, she had to exert conscious effort to control her voice, to keep it level. She didn't want to talk at all. In fact, she wanted to pull his head down and resume the interrupted kiss, to deepen it. She could feel his heart thudding fast in his chest, just as hers was. He was still erect, his stand pressing urgently against her belly through her thin gown and petticoats, and she was all too aware of the pressure. It was an intimate sensation, no question of that, and she'd wondered how she'd feel when she came to experience such things again. But she found she liked it. She had an enormous desire to touch his body, to explore his muscled back and his chest and beyond, but that would have to wait. Everything would have to wait. "And I think we should probably go back into the ballroom now before we are missed. Perhaps we could meet tomorrow afternoon, sir. Blanche has an engagement at 4. I shall plead the headache and remain at home if you care to call on me then." Captain Winterton hesitated, and she believed she could divine his thoughts. "I'm not a young lady who requires to be chaperoned at all times," she reassured him. "You need not worry about my reputation on this occasion. If you inquire whether Lady Blanche is at home, and then in her absence ask for me, I don't suppose any of the servants will think it the least odd. There are some advantages to being a widow. You are a family connection after all, and 4 o'clock is a perfectly respectable time to call. You can say you have some commission for us from your cousin Georgiana, if you wish. She is Blanche's sister now, and mine, and might easily ask you to do some small thing or other for her if you would happen to call on her first." He made a visible effort to gather his composure, and a part of this, it seemed, meant releasing her from his embrace. She thought he did it reluctantly, and as for her, it was certainly true that she had been warm in his arms, and now was conscious of a chill. It was an October evening after all, though for a short while it had felt like high summer in his embrace. "I will call on you tomorrow then, Ma'am," he said. He was a little distant now, but she would not regard it. He had agreed to come to see her, and that was the important thing. They moved towards the door, but before he opened it for her, she said, "Wait. Am I dishevelled? I would not want anyone to suspect." He looked down at her, and even in the little light that came spilling out from the windows that overlooked the garden, she saw his eyes kindle with renewed desire. Or perhaps it had been there all along. She had put off her mourning recently, on her mother's urging, and not without a pang of disloyalty that she had ruthlessly suppressed. And soon after her arrival in London, she had acquired a new wardrobe suitable to her social standing and her purpose, which was, as the captain had divined, seduction. Her new gowns were fashionable, but not excessively so, and perfectly respectable by the current standards of the ton, but many of them were cut quite low across her bosom and her shoulders, and it was clear that this one, her finest, which was a deep blue silk overlaid with gauzy fabric of the same colour, embroidered with myriad silver stars, met with his approval. "Your sleeve is a little disarranged," he said, his voice very low and husky, and he reached out and pulled it up a little, where it had unaccountably slipped from her shoulder. His gloved fingers brushed her skin, the lightest of contacts, and it was all she could do to suppress a whimper of pleasure at his touch. "Thank you," she said breathlessly. "I fear your cravat is somewhat disordered, but I do not think I can help you with it." "I will adjust it when I find a mirror," he said. "My hair has not come down." Her maid had dressed it in a new style that was all the rage in London. The long braids were coiled in elaborate fashion high upon her head, with a few strands brought artfully down and curled to fall becomingly in front of her ears. She wore no widow's cap, of course, on such a formal occasion. It felt as though the confection was still all securely pinned in place, but it was as well to be sure, and men could be terribly unobservant where such things were concerned, she knew. "It has not," he reassured her, and then, as though he could not stop himself, as though he scarcely knew what he was saying, "I wish it had, in all honesty. I'd love to see you with your beautiful hair down upon your shoulders." It was ridiculous to blush, considering what she meant to propose to him tomorrow, but Isabella was conscious of her cheeks becoming hot, and bit her lip in frustration. She meant to be a dashing, daring, unconventional sort of person, at least for a short while before she returned home to Yorkshire and a quiet life of respectable widowhood, and to colour like a schoolgirl.